20 minutes past 8, and looking regionally now at some of the driving factors that will, or at least should, create jobs, with Trefor Murphy, the Chief Executive Officer of the Recruitment consultancy, Cooper Fitch. Good morning to you, Trefor.
Good morning, Malcolm.
Thanks for coming in.
You're very welcome.
Generally, the positive global outlook amid forecasts from the IMF, corporate activity that could increase this region, including M&As and IPOs. You feel that this is one area that could provide potential jobs. But surely things like M&As and IPAs take a long time to put into place. I mean, that's a longer-term employment play that won't provide jobs this year, possibly not even next.
Sure. So, yeah, Cooper Fitch, we certainly see a significant improvement in M&A and IPO opportunities for the next 2 years. And you're right, when it feeds back down to volume jobs, it's going to take some time. What we see at the moment is both the Saudi and UAE governments particularly focusing on developing the right kind of legal framework and legislation to set out the right platform for privatization and PPP activity. So we've seen quite a considerable demand for technical PPP experts, legal advisors that can help with the framework, procurement, and people in terms of actually being able to put a transparent and competitive tender process in place, as well as technical experts, engineering and technical experts in terms of being able to advise government in terms of what kind of projects they should consider for PPP.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've talked on this show about PPPs, public-private partnerships, quite a lot recently, and wondered what the impact of the demise of the big UK construction giant PPP, which was involved a lot. It was involved a lot in public-private partnerships with the British government, and also the Saudi detentions of businessmen. We're wondering what effect that's going to have on the willingness of private companies in this region to get involved with the public sector, and just as importantly, how to price any involvement. Your views on whether you think that the private sector is a bit shy of PPP at the moment?
Yeah, certainly I think a bit shy for sure. I think this has been tried a couple of times in the region, as it has globally. I think it hasn't always worked very well. There's been some successes in Oman in the mid-90s where water, power and infrastructure projects were quite successful in terms of creating the right PPP partnerships. Part of that was they selected the right projects, and part of it they selected the right partners. But it is something that organisations, in terms of the partnering organisations and the organisations in the region, could be quite nervous of. I think what's super important is that the right legal framework is in place. There's adequate protection within the legal framework, and the laws are reflective to allow for proper PPP. Again, competitive and transparent procurement process. It's all very important, but without those things, you're not going to get the investments from the private sector.
It doesn't sound like it's an overnight fix, to be very honest with you.
Of course not.
Let's have a look at Saudi Arabia now, which has so many projects on their to-do list that it's hard to remember actually all of their ambitions, let alone how many jobs that they might create. But they've got tourist ambitions, new cities, metros, high-speed railways, cinemas, women driving. The Saudi appetite for labour will dwarf anything else in the Gulf, should they get the finance to kick all of those projects off in the short term.
Agreed.
Do you think that, I mean, obviously it's going to need a lot of people. Is Saudi going to suck up the labour, blue-collar, white-collar professional, from the other Gulf states who come ready with regional experience? I mean, could we see higher salaries in the UAE simply to try and retain staff from being sucked into Saudi?
To an extent, in some cases, yes. I think the current requirements are very much internationally based. So we're sourcing a lot of people from places like Indonesia, China, India, and Australia. So it's a lot of imported talent still. I think eventually things will catch up as Saudi develops. Of course, they're going to take some people from the UAE and other Gulf countries.
That sounds like a lot of bulk labour that you're talking about there. And I'm talking about the people with Saudi experience who are based in the sort of the free zones, the sort of the business parks around Dubai,
Yeah.
who already handle Saudi Arabia and have a lot of experience.
Yeah.
Are these the sort of people that are going to be very much more in demand?
Of course. Look, at one of the big drivers, obviously, for PPP is to reduce the spend that the Saudi government have on employees, and Saudi nationals are 90% of them still work in the public sector. So a lot of it is driven to ensure that Saudis have greater opportunities within the private sector. But certainly, it's going to put pressure on everything, on every other country in the GCC for sure.
We've had some SMSs in, Nazar writes in, saying things like mergers and acquisitions, particularly mergers, tend to reduce jobs in the long run because there are efficiencies, 2 HR departments become 1 HR department, people lose jobs. Have you seen much evidence of that?
Of course. I mean, I think there's always a level of commonality when two organisations merge, and you need to streamline. But without that activity, sometimes organisations fail to succeed. So, yes, in the short term, there's definitely a reduction in terms of headcount. But I think the long term, it's a healthy thing. It keeps environments competitive, and it keeps organisations longer term better positioned to compete globally.
We've talked a lot about salaries on the programme. A couple of salary surveys have been released so far this year. People talk about 2 or 3% increases, maybe 5% increases. What's your experience at the moment of the way salaries are going, the direction of salaries?
UAE we see 2 to 3%. Saudi we probably see maybe slightly flatter, probably 1 to 2%. We've probably learned. I've been on the show a number of times talking about salaries with you guys, and I've predicted 5, 6, 7, 8% last year. We saw last year quite flat, just over 1%, and this year we probably see a slight improvement, but not much. Good return on the banking sector. We see some good lending activity in the market at the moment, or improved lending activity, and that's allowing the banks to grow slightly again. But overall, I think it'll be a reasonably good year. But I think with a number of factors, I think salaries are going to remain quite flat.
What are you advising clients in terms of, if they come to you and say, for instance, we want to reward our people, we don't really want to give salary increases this year, but we want to actually keep them pace with what they're spending. So, how much would we have to raise salaries to cope with their expenditure on VAT and also cover other inflation?
Yeah. So VAT is obviously a tax created by the government to create revenue for the country. Nowhere in the world, when taxes have been increased, have salaries increased in line with that increase. It just doesn't happen. Cost of living is cost of living, and salary increases depend on an organisation's ability to pay salaries.
I guess to a degree that's correct, but if in fact there was a 2% hit on people's expenditure for VAT and inflation was 2%, people, if they're not getting salaries, could be 4% poorer off. And at some point, then suddenly Dubai and any city that behaves like that would start to lose its allure.
Sure. Look, the VAT rate in Ireland and the UK is between 19 and 21%.
I'm guessing salaries are comfortable there, otherwise people, would move. And a lot of people from across Europe live in London.
Yeah, look, I do think that we are going to be a couple of percent poorer in terms of the VAT. I think other cost of living things have actually softened quite considerably, and that's allowed VAT to get kind of soaked up into that. So the cost of accommodation, rent, etc., has certainly softened, including Abu Dhabi has been a very firm market for a long time. So I think probably I would probably see that the cost of the big ticket items like rent will absorb VAT very easily.
Will you be giving yourself a pay rise this year?
I'm
Sorry,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Malcolm. I don't think we close our second year at the end of January, and we've had a good year, but we'll see how that goes. Everyone else has to get their salary improvements before I look at mine.
Yeah, good. And this year, you think is going to be a bit flatter in general?
A bit flatter in general. I think there's some nice pockets of growth that will certainly book that trend.
Isn't it?
Yeah, of course. But I think overall it'll be flat with some good opportunities going into 19 and 20. I think we'll see decent return.
Well, Trevor, thanks very much indeed for coming in with your latest sort of view of the market and the effect that sort of M&As, IPOs, VAT might have on it. Trefor Murphy, Chief Executive